Let's start creating the mesh for our character. We're going to create a geometry. We can rename it character. And we're going to work within the subcontext. We're going to work from the template body. So you can type template, and this will be our main geometry. This template body has a lot of attributes that we don't really want. So we're going to delete those attributes. You can type attribute delete. We're going to delete the non-selected. So now you can see we only keep the position. We're going to do the same for the groups. So we're going to say group delete. And we're going to delete all the groups because we don't really want them either. And now we have a clean geometry. For these characters, I would like to keep the silhouette of a human being. In order to do that, we're going to use a thickness node. And we're going to calculate the thickness of our geometry. If we plug it in and we visualize it, we can see that we get a gradient from what parts are thicker than others. And that gradient comes in the form of a mask. We can change that mask by changing this ramp, and I'm going to make it a bit more intense. And now you can see that our extremities, our head, and our legs have this black color. We're going to use the white parts to multiply the noises and create different shapes. And those shapes will create a lot of different characters. We're going to use the thickness attribute to multiply noises and displace the normals of our mesh in order to create many shapes for our character. To do that, we're going to use a point bob. You can type point bob here, and you can plug it in the first input. We can dive into it. We're going to drop a displace normal. This node is going to displace our mesh along the normals. And now I made a mistake, but we want to output the displace position instead of the normals. And we're going to drop a noise, AA, which is an anti-alias noise. In its first input, we're going to pass the position of our mesh. And we're going to use the amount of our noise for our displaced normals. You can see that our mesh is being displaced everywhere along the surface, and our attribute is still not being used. And what we can do now is to call it. So we can call the bind. And here I'm going to type the name of the attribute that we created, which is called thickness. You can see the name here as well. And what we can do is to multiply our noise by our attribute thickness. And the result can go to the normal displacement amount. You can see that the mesh is not displacing as much, so what we could do is to multiply the noise. So we can make a bit of a space here. And we can drop a multiply by constant. And here can pass by to the first input. And we can put a 4. If now we go to the noise and we change the offset of our noise, we can see that it starts to create already quite a few shapes. But still it maintains the shape of the head and the extremities. What we can do is to promote these values into the upper layer. So we can promote the frequency, the offset, and the amplitude. And now this will be accessible in our upper layer here. And we can change the values from here without going to the network. Now we need to create a volume from this mesh because it's going to clean a lot of the geometry that we created. If we check the polygons of our character, you can see that there is a lot of moist and intersecting polygons. And a really good way and process is to create a volume from it, which then we will convert back to a polygon, and it will clean up a lot of these issues. To do that, we can just drop a VDB from polygons, and we can plug it in. And if we display it, we can see that we now have some sort of volume. You can see that we lost a little bit of the extremities, and that's due to the voxel size of our volume. And if we make it a little bit smaller, you will see that we get back our resolution. Be careful with this value because depending on the computer that you have, you might make it explode. Our previous noise is being used for the base mesh, so it creates a base shape of our character. But it would be really nice to have an extra one. So we can use a noise specifically for the surface, which is called noise SDF. And we can plug it in. Now if we visualize it, we can see that it does have an offset like we did before, and it's changing quite a lot already the shape for our character. As you can see, this noise is not being affected by the thickness attribute that we created, so it's really changing all the mesh. In order to bring our thickness attribute, we can bring it as a mask for our surface of our volume, and we can bring it here. We can click the VDB from polygons and bring an attribute called point thickness. and then we can name it mask. In our volume noise, we can now create a blend for our noise, and we're going to use a volume. As you can see, the vent volume is already named mask conveniently, so we don't have to change it. But if I would change the name, you can see that it does affect what we brought. It's important to note that this noise can create unwanted geometry within the volume itself. In order to visualize that, I'm going to convert back this volume to a polygon. So we can say a VDV convert. And here I'm going to convert it back to a polygon. And I'm going to visualize it. If we toggle that wireframe and we zoom inside the geometry, we can see that there is a second layer within the geometry itself. I could further visualize that by clipping the geometry. And here you can see that there is like this within layer of the volume itself. And that's not good at all because we have a lot of geometry that is not wanted. In order to fix that, what you can do is to go back to the volume SDF noise, and at the very bottom, just deactivate the post process. You will see that now we are left with the surface of our mesh, and it will be a much easier way to work with. Now that our mesh is relatively okay, we can create other operations within the volume. We could smooth it out, so we could bring back a BDB smooth, and that would make our mesh smoothed out as well. Here again, you can see that our extremities are being lost, so we can plug the second input after hours. And here the alpha mask, we can use the mask. Now we can smooth out our specific insides of the body, and the extremities are being left alone. We can create now different base shapes with the noise that we created before, and we can input different numbers in our noise, and it will create many different results. After we are done, and there is something that you like quite a lot, what we can do is to set this as our mesh. So we can drop a null, plug it in, and call it out mesh. Something worth noting is that when we create this conversion from a volume to a polygon, a lot of the times we create unwanted tiny geometry that can create a lot of issues when we try to rig this character. A quick fix for that is to use the delete small parts from labs, and basically it's going to delete the tiny geometries that are just left over. You can also just use extract the largest piece, and it will just get the main character as a whole. And that would be our main mesh. After the mesh is done, we need to generate the skeleton. To do that, we're going to use a labs node called labs skeleton 3D, if I remember correct. Yeah. And this node is a really interesting piece of software. We're going to check here. Not software, but I mean just like code inside. And it generates this skeleton with a lot of points. And it's really not a skeleton yet, but it's an outline of the inside of our character. And note that I'm not using the result mesh that we generated, but I'm using the input mesh of the template body. This will give us a more uniform mesh to work with for the skeleton. Just like we did with the template body, I would like to delete the attributes that this node generated, because there's a lot of them we don't really need, and I want to make it as simple as possible. So I'm going to copy paste the attribute and the group delete, and I'm going to put it afterwards. So again, the last is going to be a clean geometry. If we look at the rig tree of this group delete, the last node that we generated, we can see that we have the error we looked before. And actually, this is not even a skeleton, because if we remember, these points don't even have a transform. So what we could do is to drop a rig doctor and initialize the transforms. And that is going to help us to visualize the issue again. And then what we could do is to use a visualize rig. And you can visualize the rig from the rig doctor here. You can have here as well the same functionality. It's just that sometimes it can generate some errors when the viewer stays active, and I prefer to use this one. But it's actually the same, it's just inside. It's just that for me, it doesn't really work that well. But you can check the visualize rig, and then you can show parent to child relationship. And we can untick the points. And then indeed, we see now in this new skeleton that we have a few of these red arrows which are, as we saw, a wrong order for our vertices. Before we can really work with this skeleton, we should clean it up, because as we see here, we have around 565 joints, and it's way too much for a skeleton that we could use in a real-time engine. So what we can do is to fuse all these points and resample it a little bit. Let's put this aside for now, and I'm going to disconnect it. I'm going to go back to the group delete, and then we're going to work a bit with it. So we're going to create a resample, and here I'm going to plug it in, and you see that these already, the default settings are going to lower the amount of points of our skeleton. You can play with these values. You can also just check the maximum segments, and this is gonna, instead of using the length of the segments, it's gonna use per primitive. And basically it's not really what we want, because we don't want the fingers to be so high resolution. And what we would like again is to have the maximum segment length. And we can we could use a template of our body and create a resolution that more or less would be correct for our skeleton. Again, you can go into a lot of detail in this stage, because you could delete half of the skeleton and generate the other half equally. But in this course, I'm not really going to go in depth with that. I just want to make it really simple and straightforward. After the resample, we can now go to the rig doctor and visualize again if it's fixed. So if we look at here, it's still not really working. And if we look at the rig tree, I'm sorry, it is working. Actually, it is working quite well. The only issue is that now we have all these points that act as roots. This is now a good point to visualize how that can be a problem for the animation stage and other methods that we are going to do for our skeleton. And it's basically something that it originates from this resample node. Because if we would look at what it's really doing, if we explode the view, explode view from the resample, and I'm going to go back to this part. What the resample node does is that it resamples the polylines, and it creates many different new polylines, but they are not connected. A way to fix this is to use something that's called fuse, where we're going to use and fuse the points that are closer to each other. And in this case, the resample gives us 32 primitives, 71 points. And after the fuse, we only have 28 points, which is really what we want. And the exploded view no longer has that issue, because now it's one specific polyline. We can now visualize the fuse in the rig doctor. And if we go here, we can do it again. And we see that if we go to the rig tree, again, we have the issue. And the issue, again, comes from the wrong order of the vertices for our primitives on this mesh. As we did before, what we should do is to work and order the points depending on the root that we would like. What we can do, the way we can do that is to check what number our root is, which is this number 4. And we're going to do the same as we did before. So we're going to do a edge transport. And here I'm going to go to the parameters. We can also rename it distance. This is up to you, what you prefer. Edge network, we're going to select a specific point. In this case, it's our point 4. And now we have the attribute. And now we can do again the sort. We're going to sort by attribute. And remember, it's called distance. We have it here. Now our points are ordered from this as the main root. And then remember, we need the polypath, which is going to generate and clean the edges and create a proper polyline. And after that, it will basically reorder the vertices in a way that it will be usable for a rig. And if we put this in the rig doctor and we visualize it, we can see that indeed, if I'm going to take away this, now we have a good flow for our skeleton. If I now check it in the rig tree, you see that we have 0.0 as our root, which is the 0.4 that was before. And then we have eventually all the connections generated for us, which are generated from this sort distance from the root. Once we have our skeleton, we can use the rig doctor, and we could drop down a null to be able to check that this is indeed our skeleton. And what is left to do is to merge both of them, right? In this case, in Blender or other software would be to create the automatic weights for our mesh. And Houdini offers us a really handy tool, which is called Joint Capture by Harmonic. And it's gonna take 3 inputs. In this case, this is not gonna have a hierarchy, so we should not even look at it. And the first input is gonna be the rest geometry, which in this case is our mesh. It has a capture pose, which is our skeleton, and the animated pose, which we can just directly input our skeleton as well. Now, after it loads, we can check our mesh, and I'm gonna take away our template because this is our new character, which has the weights attributed with the skeleton that we just generated. And to check if everything went correctly, we can use a join deform. And we can plug these 3 outputs to the input. And if we visualize it, nothing really happens because our skeleton is in the rest pose, right? It's in this specific pose. What we need to do is to create a new pose, and that is used with this node called rig pose. And with this, if you select it and you press space, actually it's not working, 1 second, I'm gonna do it. So you have to press space in the viewport and then you enter the view of this node, the rig pose. And we can select any joint, let's say 0.6, and we can rotate it. And indeed, we see that now our skeleton is attached to this. So more or less, it's not super accurate, but it does work quite well. And again, this is more of a showcase of how can you create a process like this, not so much of how really you rig a character, but how can you use tools to create an automated process that rigs characters for you instead. We can then clear this rig pose, escape it. We no longer really need it. We could as well smooth now the attributes of the bone capture. We can do a lot of other things, but really this is our rigged and generative skeleton with a mesh, which creates a character. Once we have our character rigged and generated, we should export it to Unreal. I made a video about how to export simple skeletal meshes, and there is a few things that go into play with the skeleton transforms that I explained in that video, and I advise you that you watch that first. To fix that issue, I created an HDA to speed up a bit the process, because there is, as I say, there's a few issues with the transforms in Unreal. In Houdini, this joint deform allows us to visualize how our skeleton is deforming. So as we can see, depending the way we move it, we can see how it visualizes. But the output of this joint deform is not really what we want, because it only outputs a deformed mesh. This is a tool that we can use in order to check if it's working correctly or not. The way to export a character in Houdini is using a FBX character output. And you would need an indie license or an educational license, I think, to be able to export FBX in Houdini. And basically it has these 3 inputs as well, which are the same 3 inputs that we get from our capture weights. From this, we have different methods where we can export animations or just render the current frame. And basically here, we would like to have converted units off, and you can check it in that video. And that's why this HDA I created automates that process quite well. And as well, it will help us to name correctly our outputs, because it can become a bit difficult when we use tops with this process. So what we want is to create an FBX output, and it will automatically generate this ROP character output, and it will set the settings that are specific, that I saw and figure out myself that were the best ones. And it's going to create specific naming for the output of it. So in Unreal, we like to name assets that have a reference to what they are. In this case, this will be a skeletal mesh. So this tool will allow you to create these prefixes depending on the character, the skeleton, or even the animation. And it turned out quite handy for myself to be able to export it in different ways. I forgot to mention that this HDA will be available in the project files if you download them. And if not, you can check the other video and you will get the same result. For the output, I'm going to leave it as it is. So I'm going to export it into characters. I'm gonna leave the names as they are, so just name it character. And as we can see, the output, the file character is gonna be skm for skeletal mesh character.fbx. And all that there is to it is just to say that we want to render a current frame because now we don't have any animations. And I'm also gonna save it to disk. And I don't know if you noticed, but nothing is on screen right now. The reason is that Unreal has different sizes, so we scaled it by 100. And inside, it's also scaling it down by specific things of the skeleton. And you can check the video that I did, but this is just a package version, which is really handy. All that is left to do then is to save it to disk, and it will save the character in our folder, ready to import into Unreal. To import it is quite simple. Just drop what the output was, the skeleton character, and then we're gonna put it here, and then we just can import it all. In this case, I didn't put any animations, so I just untick animations. I leave the scales, everything as it is, just convert the scene as well, and then you can just import it. Here, these issues, there is the no smoothing group information. This is quite common within the Houdini export import within Unreal because Houdini doesn't create smoothing groups. And we also didn't make any UVs for our character, so it also makes sense that it tells us there is no UVs. But you should not worry about that because now it's not a problem. Now we can save it and we could directly drop it in our world. And we can also just simulate the physics and see how it works within the context of the world. If I simulate, you can see that now indeed it works quite well. There is maybe a few issues, but quite well, I would say it is, yeah, I think it works.